edition of the Sustaining Our World lecture hosted by the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the newly renovated Emerson Hall. It's lovely to be back here. We recognize that Emerson Hall sits on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I want to start by acknowledging the support that we have for this lecture from the Professor Reinhard F. Stettler Lecture Fund, which was supported by Professor Stettler's estate and a number of other contributors, including a few of you in this room. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for being here, and his son. Holding this lecture and hosting our speaker in Professor Stettler's honor is quite appropriate. I wrote this before I even realized how appropriate it is. Tom Hinckley will share a little bit more about why it's appropriate. Reine was appointed to the faculty of the College of Forest Resources in 1963, and in 1990 was awarded the UW's Distinguished Teaching Award in recognition of his career-long impact on generations of students. His field courses in particular were legendary for being great adventures and for turning skeptics into tree lovers and non-scientists into scientists. His groundbreaking work with genetics of populace and cottonwoods led to more than 30 years of fruitful collaboration with graduate students, colleagues across disciplines, and joint research projects all over the world. I will just say how excited I was to read the proposed title for tonight's talk, Hope on a Changing Planet, Science, Democracy, Nature, and Us. That and the summary given to us by tonight's speaker just resonated so well, given the environmental and political challenges that confront us and as environmental scientists. While identifying that much of our hope involves finding and supporting synergies between biodiversity, climate migration, social justice, and economic vitality, he acknowledges that somehow we must do all this while defending and promoting science and working to save democracy. That's a tall order. He asks, can we learn from the lessons of ecology and evolution about the broader challenges facing society? He further asks us to join him as he shares our sorrow, conveys what is known about our interactions with nature, offers hope, and redirects his own scientific journey by tacking more firmly into the headwinds of the day. Now, in order to introduce our speaker, I'd like to bring up Emeritus Professor Tom Hinckley, who has a lot of interesting intersections to share with us. Professor Hinckley.
Good evening. This is a story of history, and I think for the younger part of the audience, it's the kind of encouragement that comes that having a career over a long period of time, interesting things happen, and over time these things may come back in full circle. And so I'm going to illustrate that with today's particular talk. As noted, support for today's lecture comes from an endowed gift from former Professor Stettler and his family. I have an unusual connection between Professor Stettler, Reine, and our speaker today, Professor Peter Reich. Peter. 60 years ago, so for anyone under 30, these are numbers that you're not going to be able to imagine at this time. 60 years ago, I had my first class with Reine. He was a member of my PhD committee. 46 years ago, I became a colleague of his. 50 years ago, then Peter began graduate school at the University of Missouri. I was his advisor. Some 50 years ago, two events in which I participated have come full circle and are connected here tonight. Peter, with a BA in creative writing and physics from Goddard College in Vermont, began in January 1976 his MS in the School of Forestry, Fisheries, and Wildlife at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I was his advisor. His MS project involved identifying and documenting the factor or factors resulting in a pygmy oak system 80 years old, right next to a normal oak forest some 100 years old. His research was extraordinarily thorough in time and space. And at some point in the question series or after everyone's talk, I'm more than happy to talk about sort of the evolution of how people become creative in research and maybe some of the background elements that might help that and how you might sort of identify it. But Peter certainly illustrates a lot of elements of this. He was awarded the master's in 1977. He did post-MS work, not postdoc work, but post-MS work in 1978 in a dry tropical forest in Costa Rica with a faculty member at the University of Kansas that resulted in a multitude of publications. By the very early 1980s, he was already publishing papers as a graduate student at Cornell University, and these papers dealt with ozone, the effect of ozone on plants. And again, a host of new publications came out. And I've listed the 3 publications that came out of the master's degree. And I think statistically you'll see that's a fairly good number. He had a distinguished career, but he's still connected to the University of Minnesota. And then recently became associated with the University of Michigan and is the director of their integrated collaborative program involving around climate change. And finally, he was in 2018 elected to the National Academy of Sciences, recognizing this long history of work. So that's sort of the first part of this history story. The second part involves Professor Stedler. In Peter's second year as a master's student in 1977, I was on a program sponsored by the Department of Energy evaluating a whole new set of proposals as a result of a gas crisis. You'll all get to experience that now. A gas crisis where they were interested in developing biofuels. And there were all sorts of proposals about pineapple waste, all sorts of technological ones, but there was one study that was actually, from a biological standpoint, fascinating. And John Gordon was the chair of the panel, and I was a member of the panel. We had all sorts of industry people on this panel, and we had big arguments. Do we support a pineapple reuse to biofuels now, or do we support interesting science? Turns out we were able to get this interesting science proposal, and for 22 years, Professor Stedler and his colleague Paul Hyman from WSU had 22 straight years, consecutive years of funding from DOE that led to a highly interdisciplinary and integrative program focused on the genetics, biology, and management of populace. So here we are as a speaker tonight that I've had a connection with during a period of which I was partially instrumental in helping fund a program that led to the real success that Randy Stecker had. John Gordon was the one that gets the most credit for this, actually. So I would now, I think what the wisdom of this is, you persist in a career, and the magic starts to happen over time. And it may happen immediately. Celebrate that. But it will happen over time. Enjoy that. It's at this time I would like to transition to Peter and welcome him to the University of Washington, to Seattle.
introduction. I have to say I'm jealous. The longest running DOE project I ever had ran only 5 or 6 years before they cut us off. So 22 years sounds pretty sweet. So as you can see, the title of my talk today is Hope on a Changing Planet, Science, Democracy, Nature, and Us. This is a very different talk than the one I traditionally, or the kind I traditionally do, which is usually more full of physiology and ecosystem ecology. Probably the reason for this decision to give a talk like this is that until a couple of years ago, I never thought that being a scientist was by its very nature an act of resistance against authoritarianism. But times change. So I'm going to start with the take-home messages. First, climate change is actually a greater threat to people and nature than you think, which is scary. Second, the well-being of nature and human society are absolutely linked. This notion that somehow you have to choose either the environment or the economy is decades and decades outdated and is completely wrong. Third, despite the challenges of climate change, anti-democracy movements, anti-science movements, there is reason for hope as a noun and reason to hope as a verb. And lastly, diversity, both biodiversity and other kinds of diversity, play key roles in this, I believe. So the topics for today, to get to those take-home messages, is a bit about our changing planet, then talking about climate change impacts on biodiversity, and biodiversity impacts on climate change. And by biodiversity, I'm using that as a overall term for nature in its entirety. So I don't just mean like the number of species on a plot. I mean how many species there are, which species there are, the structure of the system, all the players. And lastly, the newer work, which is trying to couple economic, socio-economic, political science work. That's a relatively new thing for me. So by 1/4 of the way through this century, almost every biome and its species has been struggling with climate change. The picture on the top right just shows biodiversity schematically declining over time. Until now, most of that is due to land use and other issues, not climate change per se. But the bottom panel shows that the predicted extinction risk with increasing climate change is exponentially rising. So this is obviously a big problem. And the culprits are a number of elements of climate change: drought, floods, wind, pests, heat waves, and wildfire. Now, at the same time, a quarter of the way through the century, almost every biome and its people are also struggling with climate change from the same kinds of drivers: drought, floods, wind, pests, heat waves, and wildfire. And by 2060, climate change will reduce human global well-being every year by as much as the worst years ever, such as during World War II or the Great Depression. Now, who made this 2060 claim? Well, it wasn't some wild-eyed ecologist like me, but the world's largest reinsurance company, Swiss Re. Now, if you're not familiar with what a reinsurance company is, they insure all the insurance companies. So if there's anyone who has to understand risk, it's those kinds of companies. And they are the ones who did the analysis. It wasn't academicians. They've done careful analysis about climate change impacts on every aspect of the economy and have come up with amazingly dire predictions, much worse, again, than academic community has. And this actually is some of their data that we used in a publication last year about mitigation, climate mitigation and justice. Future damages are going to be, in 2060, very high everywhere, like 5 to 10% of GDP every year, which is as bad as during the Depression. But in poorer countries, those will be 10, 20, 30, or 40% reductions in GDP every year. And these are due to a combination of impacts on food production and availability, infrastructure, human disease and health, tourism, and energy systems. At the same time, as we know, emissions are per capita are much higher in richer countries. So the double whammy of poorer countries contributing less to the problem but suffering more from it is a clear case of climate injustice. But the good news is that we can stop climate change It would actually save us money in the long run. But it will take science, democracy, nature, and us to make it happen. And you can simplify stopping climate change into two bins. We need to decarbonize the energy system, and we need to incentivize terrestrial carbon storage. Now, a cartoon I like to use to think about the land-based carbon storage part of the story is this here, where we know that climate directly affects the functioning of organisms and ecosystems. It also does so indirectly by changing the biodiversity of those systems. And the biodiversity of the system influences the way climate changes influences those ecosystems. And in turn, there's arrows going back from the ecosystem function to climate through carbon sequestration and other greenhouse gases and albedo, or surface reflectivity. There you add human society on top of that. Well, we people globally are directly influencing biodiversity hectare by hectare, acre by acre. We influence ecosystem function directly and indirectly, and of course we're influencing climate. So understanding each of these arrows alone is a major research endeavor and important. Trying to synthesize all of them is what we really need to do to think about how this all works. So when I think about the role of ecosystems in climate change, I go back in time, think about where do carbon emissions end up? And what I mean by this is you take the cumulative carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and other sources every year, 100%, 90% or so, or 89%, which come from fossil fuel burning, and 11% from net land use change, principally deforestation. Of that 100% emissions, only 45% stay in the atmosphere every year. More than 50% are absorbed by the oceans and land ecosystems. And this has been happening every year since we started keeping track, and probably every year since we started pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere. So this is pretty amazing. Climate change would be 2.5 times worse if it weren't for the amazing ecosystem services of our oceans and our land ecosystems. So instead of being warmed by 1 degree now, we would already be warmed by 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And so to stop climate change, we need these ecosystem services to continue. We also can think about enhancing this multi-trillion or actually quadrillion-dollar service. And the question is, can we combine that with other ways of decarbonizing our economy to actually stop climate change in its entirety? So I'm going to start with the next part, is talking about what climate is doing to our ecosystems, because any attempt to stop climate change will both influence just how bad things get and also influence whether or not our systems can continue to sequester carbon. So as we raise CO2 and we change climate, that impacts plants and ecosystems, which feeds back again to the climate. So what happens is we turn up the heat in our ecosystems, such as this boreal forest in far northern Minnesota. Well, climate change impacts on ecosystems, something collectively the scientific community knows a lot about. I have taught a course on climate change, so I could talk to you for about 40 hours straight about this particular topic, but I'll spare you that, and I'll give one example in one system, which is the boreal and temperate forests of the world. And although the story is different for different systems, there's a lot of commonalities. Fire is a huge part of this. As many of you know, because you sit not that far from a place where a lot of fires happen in the Pacific Northwest, both in the US and Canada. Fires are amazing. In 2023, Canada broke its record for wildfires, not by 5% or 10% or 20%, 500%, five-fold higher than they'd ever had. And the picture on the upper right shows all the dots are places where in a single day wildfires were burning in Canada. And the red ones were all extreme fires. So increase in wildfires in almost every system on Earth is a big player and a big indirect aspect of climate change in the way it's going to influence ecosystems, largely detrimental even in places where fire is a natural part of the system, because these fires are more frequent and more severe than they were in the past. And fire is also increasingly globalized in the sense that wildfire smoke from the Pacific Northwest can get to New York City and create unhealthy conditions in a place like that. But I'm going to ignore wildfire now and talk about the way climate warming already harms ecosystems, ignoring wildfires, even in cold, wet environments where you'd think things should be better with warmer conditions. And that's largely due to drying air and soil. So in a warmer world, the air will be drier, something called vapor pressure deficit, which is a fancy term for the difference between a completely saturated paper towel and whatever you're comparing it to, is higher. So there's a greater evaporative demand as the air gets drier. And not surprisingly, if there's less rain and higher evapotranspiration, soils will get drier as well. So going back in time, there's a paper by colleagues in Canada using their inventory data showing that almost every tree species, all the major ones, were having increasing mortality going back to the 1960s. But they weren't really sure what was driving this. Was it insects? Was it disease? I mean, insects, disease, drought, or other things. And I was part of a study led by Martin Girardin, who's a tree ring scientist in Canada, where we used tree ring data from a network all across Canada and looked at the impacts of temperature, soil moisture, and dry air, or VPD, on tree growth. And this shows for two spruces, the black and white spruce, across Canada, with the sensitivity of tree growth, or basal area increment, to the dryness of the air the previous summer. And red shows places where the trees grew slower, blue where they grew faster. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or use AI to see that pretty much everywhere is red. So whether you're in a cold part of Canada or a warm part of Canada, drier air had negative repercussions. And Tom, as an ecophysiologist, probably can figure out the answer to this right away. Almost every plant species on the Earth closes its pores or its openings on their leaves when the air is dry in order to preserve more carbon inside the leaf, preserve more water in exchange for CO2 that diffuses in. It's baked into the DNA of every single plant species. So plant species are basically just hedging their bets, and because they close their stomates and save water, less CO2 gets in, photosynthesis happens less, and they grow less. And this is something, actually, I'm embarrassed that physiologists didn't really cotton on to this until about a decade ago, that this is probably as important as any other way in which climate change is influencing productivity globally. Well, we also started a local scale experiment to test mechanisms by which climate change and its effects on soil moisture and air dryness would influence the trees in the southern boreal forest. We called this experiment Be Forewarned. So Rebecca Montgomery and Artur Stefanski, two of my closest collaborators on this. Open air experiment, so no chambers, and we heated both the plants above ground and the soils below ground, kind of like with a thermostat in your room, made it 1.5 or 3 degrees Celsius warmer, and have looked for 15 years now at what this does to soil microbes, to plant physiology, to plant growth, and to community dynamics. And it's at 2 sites in northern Minnesota. And I'll show, I think, just 2 figures from this. This is probably the most complicated figure I'll show you tonight. From one of these cohort plantings, every few years we plant 10,000 or so seedlings, and when they get to be 8 or 9 feet tall, we remove them because we're really only looking at juvenile effect. And for 2 of the species here, balsam fir on the left and white spruce on the right, we can see that as you go from ambient to plus 1.6 to plus 3.1 degrees C under ambient rainfall, so ignore the reduced rainfall treatments, just look at where the red arrows are, that both growth and present survival over 5 years. Whoops, I left my note to myself on the slide. You can see that both species fared very poorly. So that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, about 2.5 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, caused growth to go down by 30 or 40% and survival to go down quite a bit as well. So maybe even a modest warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius can be a tipping point for these systems. So as concerned, these are important species, but tonight I'm going to talk about the fact that we have to keep hope both in our ecological systems as well as our political systems. Maybe other species can compensate. And here's 2 of the species that did well in the experiment, red maple and sugar maple. You can see the green lines going up, that they grew better with warming, relatively modest degree of warming. They grew quite a bit better. And part of this is because we grew these plants in a competitive context, so that under the slight degree warming, the competitive advantage of the maples versus the spruce and fir shifted, so their degree of change was greater than you might think just from a degree or two of change. So what about this idea that plants or ecosystems can compensate over time? I'm going to give an example from work from another group led by Dollinger et al. That was in Global Biogeochemical Cycles a year ago, where they used the island model, which is a forest model, to simulate composition, structure, and carbon cycling out to 2200. Now, we don't have time machines, so we have no other means besides models to guess what's happening in the future. And they picked 3 temperate forests in different parts of the world that went from the dry, low diversity site in the Grand Tetons, not that far from here, a temperate forest dominated by Norway spruce in Germany, and a more diverse, more mesic forest in Japan. And the disturbance rates were also highest in the Grand Tetons, intermediate in Germany, and lowest in Japan. And what they found in this model was that resilience in the system, but also reorganization, as some species did poorly and others replaced them, in essence, the ability to compensate over time, that can really alter the future carbon sinks and sources as well as other aspects. And the very different responses in the 3 systems. The Grand Tetons, the low diversity system, under all the different colors but blue are the different climate scenarios for the future. It became, I should back up, the 0 line is net zero. Above the line means the system is a sink or is sequestering more carbon out of the air. Below the line means it's a source. And under these climate scenarios, the Grand Tetons became a source for most of the next century in all those different climate regimes. The German site became a slightly larger carbon sink, or was a slight carbon sink under all scenarios. But in Japan, the model suggested a very different response, where the blue line shows under the current climate, it was pretty much net zero the whole time, but it became quite a large sink over time. And so their thought was that even though climate has negative effects in general in the short term on systems, maybe systems can reorganize, redevelop in ways that aren't necessarily as negative uniformly as we think they might be. So what are these mechanisms? And biodiversity was one of the reasons they thought the Japanese system was able to do well. What are the mechanisms by which biodiversity effects on ecosystem function allow mixtures to outperform monocultures? And when we talk about biodiversity effects here, think about a grassland or a forest stand the size of this room. So we're not talking about species extinction. We're talking about how simple or how complex the system is. That if you have more different members of a community in a space like this, the way in which they collectively are able to deal with different conditions makes the system more productive and more stable. Mechanisms include things like niche complementarity, trees being deep-rooted versus shallow-rooted, being shade-tolerant or intolerant, facilitation where maybe the shade from one species protects another from too much sun. A big one is density-dependent escape from disease and pests. There's almost ubiquitous support for the idea that the density of plant species directly influences the per capita rate of its disease burden. So in essence, the same exact species, let's say balsam fir mixed with 50% aspen, is going to be attacked less than if it's all balsam fir. There's plant-soil feedbacks. Diverse plants lead to diverse soil communities, which create more fertile soils. There's also so-called selection effects, where if you have a diverse community, by chance, one of them is going to be best suited for the conditions and do better, and also help the system be more productive and more stable. And there's quite a few other mechanisms as well. So unlike the model, which suggested that maybe the Japanese system was going to do well with climate warming because of more diversity, we actually have a lot of data from experiments and observations showing that diversity of plants, whether they're trees or grasses, and of soil microbes, actually make systems more productive and more stable. This is one of the earlier comprehensive pieces for forests globally, where a grassroots network that I helped start called the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative, collected data from inventories around the world from more than 80 countries. We saw that in any given place, when tree species richness was less than it regionally could maximally be, productivity was less. And globally, we saw this curve here where you can lose any loss of richness reduces productivity, but it gets really bad when you really lose a lot of richness. And this curve is almost identical to that which we see in grassland experiments. So what we see experimentally at the size of the scale of this room matches up in trees or grasses, matches what we see observationally here in forests globally. And diversity matters not just in that last slide, we were just looking at the amount of biomass and productivity in trees. There's just as much soil on average below ground in terrestrial ecosystems as above ground, and much more in many systems. And it was also part of another study with colleagues from the University of Alberta, where we used data from the Canadian Inventory Network, shown in the dots on the left, where there's repeat survey both of the trees but also of soil properties. And we saw that more diverse forests increase the extent to which soils accumulated more carbon. In this case, it was a 30% increase on average in soil carbon over 10 years in the more diverse forests versus the less diverse forests. So maintaining diverse trees on a landscape not only increases the productivity of the system in terms of the tree part, but also leads to more carbon storage below ground. So any way we can increase diversity, whether it's managing existing systems or planting new systems, is likely going to be beneficial. Now, this gets back to this notion of the role that our land ecosystems can play in slowing and stopping climate change. Earlier, I pointed out that we would be 2 to 2.5 times warmer already without land and ocean sinks. So we really need to maintain or help the land ecosystems maintain those sinks. And we also can try to enhance them, because it seems like there's a possibility there. And then later we'll come back to whether we can combine it with other kinds of decarbonization. So when, again, we don't have a time machine or any other way of crystal ball to look into the future other than models. This is a model by another team looking at, to the end of the century, that the net carbon sink, the NBP is the net biomass production. Again, 0 means no change. Below the line means globally, land ecosystems are giving carbon back to the atmosphere. Above the line means they're sequestering some of it. The red and the blue show for a 2.5 degree and a 6 degree warming scenarios. And in both cases, it looks like the sequestration, at least in the model, is being maintained or in some cases enhanced over the entire century. And the reason the models think this is the case is because CO2 fertilization is a thing, and longer growing seasons help in much of the world. These are offset by increased water stress, heat waves, fire, and pests. Now, I'm not always a total optimist. I actually think these models get this a bit wrong, because I actually think that the negative effects are going to be larger than the models currently simulate, and I also think that the positive effects are going to be slightly smaller. But that's just my guess. This is what the model tells us so far. So the systems, at least, we're not going to lose this carbon sequestration if the model is at all accurate. Can we enhance it with nature-based solutions? And I've come up with something I call the 1% rule, and I'll explain in a minute why I use this. And it's the premise for why even talking about enhancing the land sink is even worth thinking about. And it starts with the notion, or the fact, that there's 4 times as much carbon in soils and plants as is stored in the atmosphere. So when we think about CO2 in the atmosphere, if we could take more of it out of the atmosphere and put it in the soils and plants, that would help with climate change. And the numbers suggest that that's possible. In fact, there's 300 times as much carbon in plants and soils as is emitted by humans every year. So there's a very large pool of carbon there. And all we need to do, all we need to do, is increase global productivity or global primary production by 1% and decrease by 1% carbon losses from respiration and wildfire, and that would be enough to offset another 1/5 of annual emissions. So that's a big chunk. Nothing is a silver bullet, but it's not 1% or 2%, it's 1/5. And so how many of you who do science have ever done an experiment in the lab or in the field where you felt with confidence that you could detect a 1% change? Raise your hand. I certainly can't, if we can detect a 10% change. So we're talking about a change here that's well below our detection limits. And so it doesn't take a lot to change this. The problem, though, or the challenge is we have to do it in systems of all kinds, and we have to do it everywhere on average. And so that's the big challenge is management tweaks. They don't have to be large. We have to do them at scale. And there's promise for this. And I borrowed a number of slides, maybe a subset of them, from Project Drawdown, which, if you're not familiar with, is worth taking a look at their website. They have a lot of data on both natural and social ways of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. We can do it by additional avoided conversions. So we already have avoided conversions, meaning keeping carbon in forest and grasslands and other systems. We also can protect grasslands. We can restore tropical forests. We can use conservation agriculture. We can use tree intercropping. We can use tree plantations on degraded lands and many other approaches, each of which by themselves doesn't solve everything, but contributes to pulling down more carbon out of the air and holding it in plants and soils. To test some of these ideas, I was part of a project, again, from this GFBI initiative, where we used data from forests around the world and also remote sensing data to estimate how much unused potential was there in live forests, again, not in the soil, just in the plants, and not taking land away from cities or agricultural lands, but just an existing forest land, if we allowed those forests to have higher density and larger trees. And the answer was there was 200 to 250 petagrams of carbon unused potential in live forests. Now, if you're like me, a petagram is a giant number. Like, what does 200 petagrams mean? So again, I'm going to convert it to a different framework. And if by 2075, if we achieved even 1/3 of that increased potential storage of carbon in living forests, that would cut additional climate change by 1/6. So again, our forests, how many of you like to go hiking in old growth forests? Probably a lot of people, because they're beautiful. There's a lot of big trees. There's a lot of carbon. Trees are half carbon by dry weight. But as you drive around the landscape to get to those forests, you see a lot of degraded forests that don't have as many trees or as large trees as they could take. And of course, there's constraints. Trees aren't large in many forests because they're being used for other purposes. But also, a lot of our lands are poorly managed. And so we could do better. And we don't have to do it better everywhere. We have the opportunity to do better in enough places to make a difference. Now, we're not the only one making these estimates. This is a paper by actually a different Girardin et al. In Nature, which they claim that there's enough potential to protect, manage, and restore both working and conservation lands, forests, grasslands, and agriculture to avoid emissions or enhance sinks to offset 50% of annual increases in atmospheric CO2. Now, they didn't say we're going to do this, but it's great to at least understand what the potentials are. And so there is a lot of potential to do things, and we can incentivize this. And a lot of our current incentives actually work against this. But governments could incentivize with policies for land use in agriculture and forestry to store more carbon in the landscape. So hopefully I've given you some idea that we could, in theory, enhance carbon sequestration on land. Can we combine it with decarbonization of the rest of the economy to stop climate change? And can we do that with justice for all? So far, if you look at the black arrow, I've been talking just about sequestering emissions in ecosystems. But the pathways to global decarbonization also include decarbonizing electricity, electrifying everything, and increasing efficiency. And these solutions can play out in a number of different ways. You can adopt green agriculture, meaning low emissions, agriculture. You can increase energy efficiency and reduce use in our transportation, buildings, land use, and agriculture. Increase renewables, wind, geothermal, solar, and biofuels, and keep carbon and other greenhouse gases on land. And lastly, we can increase carbon capture and storage, spelled correctly. So one question that often comes to mind when you talk about this is that, oh yeah, the rich countries should do this, but the poor countries of the world are now emitting a lot of carbon. We can't ask them to slow their emissions because we got rich by burning fossil fuels. They should have the right to do that as well. But that makes the assumption that burning fossil fuels is actually an economically smart thing to do in this day and age. And in this paper last year that I alluded to earlier, we found examples of more than a dozen low to middle income countries that have decoupled emissions trajectories from well-being as measured by longevity and health and GDP. And basically the way they did this is they've ramped up renewables, become more efficient, and because that actually is cheaper in this day and age, there's no cost to the economy. So the notion that to develop your economy you have to pollute doesn't really make sense anymore. Now, it doesn't mean it's happening everywhere because there's all sorts of legacies of the way we've done our energy systems in the past, and there's entrenched power interests that don't want us to change. But since some countries are already showing us it's possible, it certainly seems that that can be a direction and that all countries of the world can contribute to this. And the other thing that's really important, and maybe the most important of all, and that actually gives me hope, is that it's actually too expensive not to stop climate change. In essence, the cost to stop climate change is far, far less than the economic cost of climate change. I've put a bunch of references on the left there. They include academics, but also some McKinsey & Company is the world's most highly regarded consultancy firm by many. Swiss Re also have up there. They've done the number crunching. They claim that it would take, for 25 years, investments of 7% of GDP, which is a lot of money each year. But that doesn't mean there'd be a 7% hit on the economy because those investments actually save money or replace other costs. And the actual cost would be somewhat from less than zero, which means it's actually beneficial to the economy, to 2% hit on GDP over 25 years to stop climate change. In fact, I think the McKinsey one claimed to be a 5% benefit by 2050 to the economy, 2.5% without climate change damages accounted for, and the other 2.5% by avoiding climate change damages, versus at least a 5 to 10% damages from GDP from climate change. So the corporations already understand, many of them, that their business models require us to do something different. And if they can think longer term than the next quarter, they have the capacity to start doing something about this. So I think that greed, not good intentions, will be one of the things, or at least in part, that saves us. That some rich corporations will realize that they can be even richer by outcompeting the other companies and helping us figure out pathways to decarbonization that make them a lot of money. And that, in the end, save them from the damages they're going to see from climate change. And I'll come back to this later in a couple of slides about a CEO who put this into practice with their own company. And additionally, when you think about the carbon economics, the adverse consequences are so extreme that some economists have already calculated that unilateral decarbonization pays for itself already in large economies. Meaning the notion that, oh, the US shouldn't decarbonize unless China does, or China shouldn't unless the US, that these countries are big enough that their decarbonization would slow down climate change to save them money, even if the rest of the world doesn't. That's how dire the consequences are. But that makes it seem like some point some countries will start to do this because they realize it's in their best interest even if other countries aren't. So I've been arguing that we can enhance our quadrillion-dollar nature-based service on land by sequestering more carbon there that there are ways to do that, and they're economically viable, and that there are ways in which we can decarbonize, and in fact, it will save us money, not like 150 years from now, but within the next 10, 20, 30 years. But will we? Will we do the things that make sense? And here's where maybe democracy circles back in. I think of science as being linked to and maybe underpinning how we learn about and think about nature, people and justice, and democracy. So where does democracy come in? Well, I think democracy matters for a number of reasons. Democracy, which in my mind actually embraces idea diversity. Dictatorship doesn't usually allow more than one opinion on anything. Democracy actually helps governments be effective. It's a paper from 15 years ago, which researchers quantitatively tracked the number of metrics for democracies of different countries and looked at their government effectiveness. And there's a general increase where the countries that were most effective tended to be those with the highest levels of democracy, and those that were least effective also had the lowest democracy levels. Now, this doesn't always have to happen in every way. There are a couple of examples that are well known. Places like Singapore and Malaysia are not very democratic, but are actually have pretty effective governments. And so it's not necessarily an R squared of 1. But in general, it looks like where democracy happens, governments are more effective. Cause and effect, who knows? And we also see in the database that we compiled that strongly democratic countries are also less vulnerable to climate change. Again, this is probably only partially due to democracy, but probably part of the way in which their governments are set up to protect people with infrastructure is related to democracy. Now, we all know that democracy is under attack globally, and along with it, so are science, truth, justice, and the rule of law. So I have a question I'm asking myself that is going to become like one of my research endeavors in the next year or 2 or 3, and that is, does political repression and disinformation result in a loss of what I'm calling idea diversity? Again, the notion that if you have an autocratic dictator, whether it's of one country or another, and you don't allow different ideas to flourish, that has negative repercussions. Does it reduce the efficient use of resources? Does it reduce productivity and stability? And maybe most imaginatively, and not necessarily in a direct line, is have any relationship to the way in which loss of biodiversity influence stability and productivity in ecosystems. In essence, can the agents of thought and ideas and opinions in a corporation or a government play the same role that species that have different traits and attributes in an ecosystem do? And in what ways do those analogies work, and in what ways do they not? Surprisingly, although there's economists and other people have dabbled in trying to relate diversity to productivity in universities and in corporations and in governments, there's not a lot of data out there yet. And it's complicated and tough data to get. Just giving a couple of examples, there's a study that showed that what they called racial fractionalization, which is really just diversity, that states with higher racial fractionalization tended to have per capita, meaning per person, higher economic growth. And on the right, there was a study showing that within the racial diversity level and gender diversity levels were related to sales revenues in businesses. Now, there are other studies that don't find these tracks, but it's not a very well-developed field yet. And I was actually talking to an economist the other day in the business school at Michigan who thought it would be really interesting to dive into this more, because there's actually a lot of data. Countries like China, they know every restaurant, they know what's on the menu, they know the ethnic background of every owner. So, information is often put to poor use, but the existence of information can also be used to address questions that are otherwise hard to address. So, where do we find hope in a world full of anti-democracy and anti-science movements? I'm going to give two examples from very different spheres. The first is the CEO I mentioned, someone named Paul Polman, who was CEO of Unilever for 10 years or so, and then more recently wrote a book called Net Positive. He really pushed his company to think about sustainability. One of the first things he did, actually, before he became CEO, is he said, we're not putting out quarterly reports, we're not making quarterly estimates, which Wall Street loves those. And his whole notion was like, that's not really, if we do that, every company does that, we're only paying attention to the short term. And that you have to pay attention to every term, short term, medium term, long term. And in his book, he talks about several different things about why he thinks corporations can and likely will, but certainly can lead ahead of governments in slowing climate change. First is that they have the capacity, the scale, leverage, and speed of act. They control the global supply chains, whether you're talking about energy, land use, agriculture, materials, logistics. They're much more globally integrated than any government. And much of climate impact and biodiversity loss sits in those supply chains, and corporations can change them via procurement standards, product design, and capital allocation. Government entities or quasi-government entities like the EU also can with some of their policies, as could we, and as does the state of California within the US and some of its policies. And lastly, corporations can move much, much faster than governments on decisions about using renewables, about deforestation-free sourcing, fertilizer, pesticide use, and circularity. So this shows that they have the capacity to make an impact. He also claims that they have a strong reason to make an impact, and that's because their economic self-interest is increasingly aligned with sustainability. Just like major countries like the US or China maybe now on their own should reduce emissions because it has a positive impact even if no one else does it. Corporations are large enough, and collectively certainly, for it to make sense. He claims the business case is lower energy costs from efficiency in renewables is, in the first place, is useful, even if it doesn't stop climate change. But if you also reduce disturbances associated with climate change, that reduces supply risk. There's also branding, reputation and license to operate benefits of doing the right thing, and also better access to capital as investors price in climate risk. You could see as Swiss Re starts to charge insurance companies more because of climate risk, those insurance companies can start charging corporations more. Now, the other example I'm giving is a completely different sphere. It's from the people. And it's from a place where democracy often works and bends towards sustainability. My home state of Minnesota, or one of my home states, a place with agriculture, forest, urban and rural mixtures. And I'm going to give 3 examples: climate mitigation, food security and justice, and democracy. The first, and I think Washington probably mirrors these in a lot of ways. In 2023, Minnesota passed a clean energy standard that requires electric utilities to provide 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. It took 15 or 20 years to get this passed, but now it's law, and most of the utilities are ahead of the curve on this. Afterwards, I'll be curious whether all these examples have very similar analogies. In Washington, I bet they probably do. The next one is about food security and justice, taking care of people, especially those most needy. In the same year, there's a state law about a free school lunch program where there was free school breakfast and lunch for all K-12 students in the state. And that's something that is standing up for poor people, standing up for members of our community. And the last example is that people of Minnesota resisted the illegal and unconstitutional invasion by the federal government, which was really there to intimidate a state which was not going along with Trump, even though they used the guise of immigration reform. So they resisted this repression and intimidation, and there were probably 100,000 people out on a 10 below 0 Fahrenheit day in protest. And by being peaceful and being persistent, it changed the national tenor and changed the view of people around the country, whether this serves as a model for resistance and or changes the policies so that if we have fair elections in November, which I'm not entirely sure we will, but if we do, and in 2028, maybe the pendulum will swing back and we'll become the country, imperfect country, but a better country than we are today. And so back to the take-home messages, climate change is real, and it's going to become a huge threat. It's, if any of you own homes, and maybe it's not the same in Washington as the Midwest, house insurance, is through the roof because of climate change impacts on things like hailstorms, something that, doesn't kill anything, but it damages things, and people have to pay a lot of extra money for home insurance. So climate change is a huge risk. Agriculture, forests, infrastructure, it already costs every single person on this planet, directly or indirectly, money, and it's going to get more and more over time. And it also has a big hit on nature. And secondly, the well-being of nature and human society are absolutely linked. The notion that we can't preserve biodiversity or stop climate change because of the economy makes no sense, because in fact, we need to do both simultaneously. We need healthy nature to preserve ecosystem services, and we also need to spend money to stop climate change to preserve those services. So despite the kind of direness of these first two bullets, despite these challenges and anti-democracy and anti-science movements as well, there is reason for hope and reason to hope, because nature is resilient and has capacity, and human society does as well. And hope is both a verb and a noun. And the very last slide here is that I think of hope as a conscious choice, an act of resistance, and a power of community, as Bruce Springsteen said when he came to visit us a couple months ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for making the case for hope. We all need that. We have take a few moments for questions. We can take questions from the audience here. We also have some people online. If you're listening online, and want to enter a question into the chat. And
I kind of have two questions, but I think one is more interesting than the other. So I hope that someone asked a less interesting one, which is about the effect of increased carbon dioxide in agriculture, and this idea that we're going to grow a bunch of fat plants filled with carbohydrates instead of fiber. Somebody else asked that. Here's the interesting one that I want to.
Here's the interesting one that I would like to maybe get more of your thoughts on, and that is this idea that the graph with the democracies and idea diversity. You talked about effects in an economic context, which I think we all kind of intuitively understand, but I'm thinking back to times in the history of this country, maybe after, right around World War II, when scientists came to this country and solved a lot of problems and contributed in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering, how do you get the message out that the reason we need democracy is for idea diversity, so that, yeah, we can maybe make more money that way, but what about the very real problems that we face in many different sectors of society, and that we're never really going to make headway on that unless we have diverse ideas for how to solve these problems. So I'd be interested in how you would go about collecting data on that. You mentioned you might be writing a future paper in that area. Do you have any thoughts you can share with us about that?
Sure. The question was whether or not idea diversity could play a role in solving all the other problems we face, not just helping the economy grow larger. So to start with, I was just using that as one example, because not that we need to get the idea of making rich people richer, but the idea that everyone in this country, especially like some huge fraction of our kids still suffer from hunger in the richest country on earth, that maintaining and building economic productivity is useful. Like the states where there's more diversity and the economy is better, also states where fewer of the kids go hungry. So the economic, it's not just about money, it's about the role that money can play in helping make people's lives better. But there's all sorts of other ways you could ask this question. What does it mean for education? What does it mean for housing security? What does it mean for access to medicine? What does it mean to, to medical care? Many other things. This is an area where you really need social scientists working with political scientists, working maybe with natural scientists to answer and address these questions. Because unlike measuring, I can measure the biomass of a tree and we know pretty accurately how much carbon's in it. When you're dealing with social systems, the degrees of freedom are large, and being able to know what metrics to measure through, whether it's through surveys or through other measures, and you can find correlations, but understanding the causal relation is much more challenging. So I think there's probably many ways. There's lots of data, because we keep data in this and many other countries on people's access to health care, people's health statistics, people's health, people's education. So census data in many countries has a lot of really amazing data like this. But I don't think because our sciences are so siloed, I don't think this has been a topical area very many people have looked into.
Examining democracy through this lens of liberalism and liberal democracy, when liberalism and liberal democracy broadly and the protection of capital through liberalism and liberal democracy are largely responsible for both the economic systems which are contributing to climate change, the systems which are leading to the anti-democracy in the global south, and why through through liberalism, are we trying to solve the problems which liberalism has created, and the liberalism which both historically and currently, in order to protect capital interests, routinely slides into anti-democratic notions, as opposed to say, maybe Marxist analysis isn't the best for this, as it is a bit more complex than the economics of maybe classical Marxism. But where's the balance, and why are we so focused on the role of capital and liberal democracies when they cause these problems in the first place?
So the question is, why was I emphasizing the notions of democracy as indexed by these researchers when democracy or countries that claim democracy have created capitalist systems that have led to all these problems in the first place? And protected and favored capital interests. Is that a fair summary of it?
I was more trying to think like liberalism, liberal democracy routinely, historically, and currently slide into anti-democratic notions, whether it be Germany in the 1930s, as the liberals of Germany sided with the Nazis to displace the communist trade unions, socialists. Or even today in the U.S., how we're backsliding away from maybe social progress in an effort to continue these systems of capitalism which are causing these issues.
So I think the answer is that there is no simple answer. That all of the different countries of the world that might be considered democratic aren't equally, don't have the same policies in terms of social welfare as each other, don't necessarily protect capital or favor capital the same way as one another, and have different, you're shaking your head as if, maybe none of them are perfect, but everything is relative. When you compare those to countries that have less democracy, they probably do worse. And so just because they're insufficient doesn't mean that we shouldn't push for more of that, and that maybe there are the cases, like you gave the example of Germany. Actually, in every so-called democratic country, you have a whole range of people whose opinions span from one side of the spectrum to the other. And the governments slide across that spectrum when there are elections that push people into power. Germany, 10 years before or 10 years later had a very different government. And so there's, so it's not like the way you framed it sounded like democracy led directly to Hitler, and that's a logical and sole outcome, when there's 100 different ways that these stories have transpired. And so I think whether or not the ownership of economic entities should be, who those should be and how they should be run, that's obviously part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. And I think it gets back to this notion of sometimes countries like China, which is obviously not democratic, but they can decide to build light rail everywhere and do it, which has benefits, but then they also trample on the rights of people who might be against that. And so one could, depending on the framework, one could argue like where on the spectrum of valuing the better for everyone versus the better for individuals should a government sit. And there's no, I don't have an answer to that, and there maybe isn't an answer. Because it depends on whether you're the one who's being influenced adversely by decisions of the government for the overall good.
Thanks for this, Peter. I have a question for you that maybe brings it back to the Tom's introduction at the beginning, talking about your master's work, which was really on plant communities or like oaks, right? And coming at it from a purely ecological perspective, you're seeing a pattern and trying to explain the process in the environment. And a lot of our students here in STEPS, our graduate students, are here studying natural sciences, ecologists, environmental scientists, but we're doing this work because we deeply care about the world. You are someone that has worked your way, and maybe you probably always cared about these things, but you've worked your way from, being centered in maybe basic sciences into integrating social science and thinking about not just the scientific solutions to our problems, but the social solutions. I'm curious if you have any advice for our graduate students who are here learning about the natural sciences and scientific solutions, how they can begin to also think about the social solutions and integrate those into their work.
Sure. So the question was, do you have any thoughts on how students here and anywhere might pay attention to social issues as well as the science that they're focusing on? Well, first, I'm not suggesting that every person has to simultaneously study natural systems and social systems. You have to learn things one step at a time. But I do think that we're both better citizens and also better scientists when we pay attention to things outside of the narrow focal part of our science. And that studying another part of science not only makes you, whether, if you're a soil microbial ecologist and you also study plant physiology, it's not just beneficial because now you know something else, but because what you learn there is probably going to affect your thinking about the other subject. And actually, I learned myself that very early on when my first 3 or 4 research projects were very different. I studied, I asked why were these oaks pygmied naturally on a bluff in Missouri. Then I went in Costa Rica and studied differences between deciduous and evergreen trees in a semi-deciduous dry forest in Costa Rica. And then I worked in ozone and acid rain pollution they seem like they're completely unrelated, yet there are elements of each that came back to me when I was thinking about the next problem because they had some commonalities. For instance, the trees were pygmy on this site in Missouri, in part because probably the horizon, the upper horizon of soil had been washed away, and it was highly acidified and had low calcium magnesium and high aluminum, which is something you get with acidification from acid rain. The tropical trees have very poor stomatal control, rainforest trees, which is something you see with ozone pollution. Trees lose their stomatal control. And so there's elements of these things that and so you start to say, why did these both happen? Is there some connection? And so I think that although we actually do need some people who are so single-minded that all they think about is one thing in more and more detail, I mean, I think we need people like that, but not everyone has to do that. And our reductionist science tends, and the way we silo our sciences tends to bring people into that. So I think we need both those people who study something at finer and finer grain, but also people who start to think and make connections across. And you can do that through your own work or through working in the narrow science, but still paying attention to the world at large.
This question is connected to the decarbonization part of your talk. I feel that the only issue until we approach greenwash solutions is that if we tie it to profits, then people don't tend to think, for instance, outside of the US. They think decarbonizing the US, the Green New Deal, like the whole premise of it was great if you thought within the US, and it stopped being great when you thought about where the pieces that you need to make that technology come from. And if you still live within a profit-driven society, then the externalities just get shipped to other countries. And so we saw, like in the Congo, there's a lot of examples in Africa, for instance, of pretty dire conditions as a result of mining for these things that we need for all of the renewable technology available. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with those things that you can't decouple when you're approaching this from a capitalist perspective?
The question was how, given that there are, I'm trying to think how to rephrase the question. There are consequences, you're basically in a capitalist system, consequences of decarbonizing when you think of that decarbonization in one country but ignore the repercussions somewhere else, for instance. And I think that's absolutely a true problem, and there's two aspects I'm going to talk about. The first is that it's kind of like the question about, democracy, whether that's a useful concept or not in this case, is that we can think about things from a different perspective than simply the footprint or the location of certain countries and certain decarbonization. That's where some of the international corporations, for instance, they don't operate just in one country. They operate, many of them, all over the world. And given that the world we live in is a capitalist system, and even the communist countries are really capitalist, they just have a different, he's shaking his head, I think they are, they just have a different form of government. Given that the world is driven by capital, we need to figure out how to deploy that capital in a better way. It'll never be perfect, but you could both have policies that countries could put in place that try to incentivize doing things that decarbonize, and especially in the case where if helping corporations make more money also makes the planet cleaner on average. It seems that even if you think that making those companies richer isn't a good thing, the co-benefit is a good thing. And so I think given the world as it is, we need to try to, it's going to be hard enough to stop climate change. The notion that we're going to get rid of capitalism, around the world seems much more challenging, whether we think it's a good idea or not. The second part of this was that I think we do need to keep in mind the relative impacts and advantages of policies at a global scale. So mining is, especially the way it's done now, and it could be done better. It's always going to be challenging to do well. It could be done better, but even if it's done poorly, the number of people whose lives are negatively affected by that is relatively small compared to the number of people's lives who will be hugely benefited if we stop climate change. And so, so I think you have to keep in mind, it's like the whole notion when I talk about justice, almost every climate mitigation someone will complain about because it's going to have negative impact on someone. And those negative impacts could be better distributed across the population, so often on someone who is poor and disadvantaged and has less power. But we also have to think about the aggregate effects. And so because climate change is going to have such a negative impact on the poor people around the world, stopping climate change, even if you did it in a way that continued injustices of every mitigation, would still be beneficial for justice overall because of the imbalance in the number of people affected. And the data certainly supports that. And so we certainly don't want to be doing it in a way that disadvantages people when we don't need to. And so I think it's really a case of collectively people, whether it's through governments or corporations or other ways, and I don't know what other ways there are other than sometimes social choice like boycotts or things of that nature, need to push the agents of power to do these things and to do them in the right way in as many ways as possible. I don't have there is no perfect solution, but I think that we have to live in the world as it is, and we have to try to make that world work better, and that there are ways in which that can happen. Or at least I hope that there are.
Thank you. You've given us a lot of food for thought and incited a lot of good thinking. Appreciate your time and recognize it's getting late, whether it's Michigan or Minnesota time, so appreciate you being there.
Montana time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all the thoughtful questions, because I don't have the answers. We all need to collectively come up with those answers. So each of those questions has room for a lot of discussion in trying to find what solutions both exist in theory, and then how do you put those into practice.